Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Big Ideas in Cannabis here on the Beard Brothers Media Network. I'm Cassie Tomaselli, your host. I am the founder of the boutique content marketing agency Tomaselli Media, as well as The Green Room, a new thought leadership and personal branding membership for cannabis executives and rising professionals. And I'm super excited to bring on my guest today, who is Jeremy Shechter of Open Source Horticulture. And we are going to be talking a lot about cultivation and operations and data and lots of good stuff around SOPs, and just excited to dive in. So Jeremy, thank you so much for hopping in and spending some time with us today.
Yeah, of course, Cassie. Thanks for having me.
So to kind of kick things off here, Jeremy, I would love for the audience just to get to know your background. If you could just give us a brief explainer on your background, not just in cannabis, but in the traditional horticulture industry as well, and what you do through open source.
Sure. I've a cannabis consulting firm, Open Source Horticulture, and we service mostly cannabis clients, but also work on the food production and conventional CEA side. And before that, I've been consulting nationally for cannabis companies for the last 4 years with Pickle Consulting, working all around the country, a few million square feet we've worked on. And before that was at Buckeye Relief as our vice president of operations and was on their initial starting team, getting everything set up and designed and built. And I also started my career in more commercial greenhouse production, and a big soft spot of mine is definitely aquaponics. So I was aquaponics manager for years at the start of my career, and designed a bunch of commercial aquaponics systems and got to play with a lot of fish, and also grew vine crops and leafy greens, lettuce, herbs, things like that, and have been really, involved in horticulture in a whole bunch of different ways for years. And it all started with an agricultural engineering degree from Ohio State in our beautiful state of Ohio.
Yeah, there are a lot of common threads that pull us together, Jeremy. We both started in traditional horticulture. We're both Ohioans, graduated from Ohio State, and now are in the cannabis industry. So it's kind of cool to see two folks kind of following the same path within marketing and media and cultivation. So that's super fun. And we just came off of the Ohio Cannabis Health and Business Summit this past weekend too. And where Jeremy was a speaker and a moderator for a cultivation session. So Ohio just in and of itself, I know you work all over the country, Jeremy, but Ohio in and of itself is just a great market to be involved in. It's expected to reach $1 billion by the end of the year this year. So I know there's excitement from a lot of folks about getting in this space here.
Yeah, and what's really cool about Ohio? So I don't currently have any clients in Ohio, so but I still talk to a number of cultivators in the state, and I keep in touch with them, and I keep tabs on the market, vested interest living here. But what's really cool about Ohio is the market is about 7 or 8 years old now, and getting a chance to meet with the cultivators in the state, like on that panel was Standard Wellness, Ascension Biomedical, Riviera Creek, and FRX, and they care so much. Sometimes you hear about just growers becoming jaded over time after, frustration after frustration and, regulation stuff and, whatever difficulties, they just get beaten down. Yeah. I did not feel that in Ohio. They still love what they do. They've got that sparkle in their eye. They're innovating and making changes, and they really care about the product they put out to the market. That's most of what we spend our time talking about. So it's just really refreshing to be able to hear stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that really aligns with like the Midwest spirit too. Like we're hardworking, gritty people. So none of what you said surprises me whatsoever. So, and I'm really glad to hear that it hasn't made people jaded.
I gotta say, I've heard like having grit being used as a character descriptor, but not gritty people. I like that.
Oh, okay. I have to recommend a book to you then. It's a book by a PhD, Angela Duckworth. Her book is
Oh
called,
yeah,
and it talks about like the ways that people can be successful, not just because they're smart, but because they kind of have that adaptability, can do like attitude. I'll send you the link to it after this. I think everybody should read it, honestly.
there's
But
maybe you'll edit this part out, but there's a whole thing about that book, and yeah, we could talk later about it though.
Oh boy. Okay, yeah, I can't wait to hear about that because it's been some years. I read it like, I don't know, 7 years ago maybe. So if there's been new research or whatever's gone down since then, I'd love to hear about it. So we're here today to really talk about your work, Jeremy, in cultivation and operations. Um, a lot of what you do is kind of going into these facilities and helping people kind of find inefficiencies or ways of improvement, and working really in tandem with like a director of cultivation and their C-suite to help them achieve their business objectives too, not just on the horticulture side, but on like the broader balance sheet. And so I think a lot of people may not understand like how you factor into these cultivation facilities. They might think, well, I have a director of cultivation or a VP of cultivation. Don't they just handle ops? So I'd love for you to kind of just walk us through your work and how you really integrate into these facilities and provide the support that they need to kind of keep things flowing smoothly.
Yeah, totally. And that's a really fair question. And it is a really important one to tackle. And there's two kind of hackneyed sayings that I think are really apt here is, seeing the forest for the trees, and it's hard to see the label when you're inside of the bottle. And so what I am is, at least to start, a lot of times, is just simply another perspective. When somebody is doing the same thing day in and day out, it's hard to kind of see outside of what they're normally looking at. But you get another set of eyes, and then you get another perspective, and it's really really easy to catch things that other people miss. So even talking before, like the skill and the expertise and stuff like that, just having another set of eyes is can be super valuable. But a lot of times where I fit in, is a lot of coaching. I don't try to go into facilities with a really heavy hand, Robert Irvine or Gordon Ramsay, going into a kitchen. It's nothing like that. It's much more of, listening to people, hearing what their pain points are, what they're struggling with, whether it's, lower potencies than they want, or maybe lower yields, or issues with equipment, or equipment manufacturers not being responsive, or whatever. There can be a million and one different things. So I spend a lot of time listening and hearing what their pain points are, and then trying to meet them where they are to get them to where they need to be. And that's huge, because if you go into a facility, meet with the team and directors of cultivation or owners or C-suite or whatever, and you have some preconceived notion of what needs to happen, it's not going to get delivered in a way that can be heard. And two, you might just miss the whole point, because everybody has different market constraints and different budget constraints and staffing constraints and yada, yada, yada. So there's a lot of different variables that you really need to get a grasp on before you can really effectively help people. I don't think it's enough to really give people the information that they need and expect them to execute it. It's more about, yes, giving the information to people that they need to, improve their operations, but it's also like doing it in a way and executing that it'll actually happen.
Yeah.
And that there's buy-in. Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of consultants in this space get a bad rap because I think they come in and they don't listen and they think they know the answer and they kind of push that on the team, and then you get that inevitable resistance of no, my way's better. Or it's a one size fits all approach. And cultivation is just not that way. Never has been.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And everybody, you know, their facilities are tending towards kind of like a lot of similarities, you know, kind of cookie cutter. But even if you took, you know, a facility that's running the Fluence lights and pip racks and, you know, H. Anderson skid and growling, you know, whatever recipe, the facilities are way different because it's different people and, you know, different schedules and different cultivars within the facility. And yeah, consultants have gotten a terrible rap for that and a number of other reasons. And that's a big reason why I've tried to distance myself and open source horticulture from kind of the rest of the consultants in the space for a number of reasons. You know, operate a lot differently. Other consultants have, you know, made mountains of money by taking commissions off of equipment sales to their clients for, you know, equipment or consumables that they don't need, and the client pays for that. So, you know, at open source, we don't take any kickbacks or commissions for anything. All of our revenue comes through from the client. So we make sure to stay agnostic and always have the client's best interests at the front of what we do.
That's so helpful. And yeah, and I'm sure even the vendors, they appreciate being able to pass that savings along to the cultivator also. And then you know that you're getting the right equipment, you know, that you're not just getting something that's super biased. So I'm really glad to hear that. So in addition to kind of going in, listening, problem solving, you've talked a little bit about this idea called process mapping as it relates to operations in a cultivation facility. So can you kind of take us through what process mapping looks like for those who may not be familiar with the term? And how can it kind of help identify where things are breaking down or where maybe improvements are hiding even in like plain sight?
Okay, so this is an enormous topic, Cassie, and
I'm ready.
a really fun one. So, you know, going back to there's a lot of ways to skin this cat. Well, you know, that's talking cultivation. Now we're talking, you know, full operations, cultivation, post-harvest, processing, packaging, fulfillment, sales, you know, you name it. There's so many different ways to do this, and there's no standard way. You know, everybody makes products differently and does things a different way. But what most people don't do or haven't done, for, you know, a number of very good reasons. This is not talking about incompetence or anything. It's just out of necessity. You know, you set up these different departments and you try to make them run as efficiently as possible. But it's really easy to not think of them like, you know, connected in like a larger ecosystem. And a lot of times they are siloed within the facilities. And so what process mapping is exactly, you know, what it sounds like. You're just basically creating a visual diagram of, you know, the product flow for all the way from start to finish. So everything from starting seeds or taking cuts off your mom to veg to flower to the dry room to the cure room, how it gets trimmed, how it gets denugged, you know, what parts get processed, yada yada. You see, you want every single process on there to lay it out, and then to see, you know, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, what data makes sense to be captured there, and where, you know, potential profit leaks are. And it's incredibly important to do an exercise like this in anybody's facility. I help clients do it in their facilities, to be able to really identify, one, you know, what data is important to be collecting in your facility. And, you know, there are plenty of data out there that is not important. It's collectible and analyzable, but, you know, if you're not going to be making decisions based on, you know, the data, there's no reason to really collect it or analyze it. So collecting the right data, identifying the right KPIs, but then really like that's the only way to truly home in on and identify inefficiencies within your facility, is starting with, a process map, identifying where we're at, benchmarking, collecting the data, and then being able to track that over time. And there's so many little details. Even just something like, probably an easy one to understand is, within the post-harvest department, you've got several different functions, but there's trimming. So sometimes you bring material into a trim machine and then QC it afterwards. Sometimes it's all hand trim, whatever. Right. Some of the metrics in post-harvest, like your flower to popcorn ratio or your flower to trim ratio, or even the potency delta between the trim and the flower. These are all critical metrics that need to be tracked to make sure that you're not losing yield, you're not over trimming things. But then also, looking at this from a systems approach, from trimming, you have like some final weights, call it like final flower weight, popcorn weight, trim weight, from a harvest. And then those get tested. Well, sometimes, the weights don't match up, like what's getting tested versus, what was weighed in the trim room. And so, it's hard to find when there's discrepancies if you're not tracking these things. And, what comes out of this step is what comes into that step, and making sure that they line up. There's a lot of data entry errors that can happen, that can really screw things up. So process mapping is super important to be able to, it's the first step in truly performing continuous improvement activities on your facility.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mapped that all out for us. And I think not just in terms of what data you should be collecting, but it seems to me that it probably eliminates a lot of like process redundancies also, where you might just be wasting money by doing like replicated processes, or maybe not two people need to be doing this. Maybe it could just be one person, or just some of those kinds of things that people can just fall into in a routine without really stepping back and looking at it and being like, do we really need to do all these things? Or are we missing a critical step that could save us time down the road?
For sure. Or, it helps with dialing in crop performance too, and like overall facility KPIs. The cultivation might see a strain that is, really easy to work with. Maybe it's high potency, high yield, and like, all the numbers work out, from that side. But then when it gets over to post-harvest, maybe the buds break apart, and, very little of it can actually be sold as, gram flower, in Ohio, 2.83 unit size. But like, top shelf, high quality stuff, it breaks apart, and most of it has to be sold as popcorn at half the price. It doesn't really matter that it yielded so much or that its potency was really high. It's still being sold at a discount because of, other consumer preferences. And so you'd be able to see that, and then, also map on different like values to different product types down the road, to be able to really holistically look at, okay, that strain, it seems to match all the metrics, but it's actually one of our least profitable strains because it can't be sold as high quality flower. Or that's just a random example, but you can see, like, you really need all these things talking to each other to really make good data driven decisions in your facility.
Yeah, and I think that's probably happens in a lot of facilities too, where like the C-suite maybe who's kind of making some of these business decisions is disconnected from the cultivation, or maybe the cultivation doesn't realize the numbers on this side, or vice versa, or how hard it is to grow this particular cultivar, or what a strain on labor it puts on, or how you really have to like align those things like at the get-go, or else you're kind of just, draining resources.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of facilities that you'll go to, there's always, not always, but most of the time, like the sales team and or the C-suite is kind of at odds with the growers. Kind of, the growers want to grow like the very interesting and like high terpene good smelling plants, and of course the sales team wants whatever the market wants, and high potency stuff, and the C-suite has some other ideas. So there's a lot of kind of personalities and objectives differing, but it's so cliche to say, but like communication is so extremely important, and to be a little more pointed about that, like regular routine and open communication, regular sales meetings and stuff. And that's my previous employer, at Bickle Consulting, the tagline, and this is not mine, I'm not stealing it, but I think it's really good, is bridging the gap from the grow room to the boardroom is something that as consultants is absolutely critical to do. Not just to be able to communicate technical details up to executives, but to also work between those two parties to align goals, make sure that everybody's rowing the boat in the same direction, and getting people aligned, and quite frankly hearing each other. Sometimes it's hard to hear other people when you've got a different opinion. So really understand that and help with that, and it provides a ton of value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of want to take it back to the data for a moment, because I think you're probably communicating a lot of that data back and forth between the two departments. But one thing we talked about previously is that, it's one thing to say that you're a data-driven company. It's another to analyze that data actually properly. And you gave that great example of the post-harvest, but I'd love to kind of hear if you have any other examples from cultivation of where, what's something that maybe not for a certain cultivator may not be as important to kind of collect and make decisions off of versus what is actually a super valuable metric.
Okay. This one could be potentially a little controversial, but it's pretty fun. Data is difficult, and there are lots of people out there who are, data. I am not a data scientist by any stretch, but I am a pragmatist, and I understand what makes sense and what doesn't. And just to preface this, at the end of the day, cultivator, specifically people in cultivation, they wear a lot of hats. They do a lot of things, and have a lot of meetings with other departments, and have to think of pests and employee stuff and irrigation and whatever. There's a lot going on. So what ends up happening is a patchwork of environmental control systems and ERP and labor tracking, and maybe several different online cloud-based UIs to look at for data, and then not to mention a slew of spreadsheets tracking everything from irrigation data, which could be feeds, irrigation data with monitoring root zones and drybacks, and irrigation data with pitcher validations and leachate spreadsheets, and that's just your maintenance logs on the irrigation equipment, and that's just so it's all kind of scattered. There's no central framework. There hasn't been that process mapping done to tie things together. And so everything, even within a department, can be on an island. And so I guess maybe that's not really your question. I'll come back to your question in just a second. But a huge, going back to the process mapping a little bit, this stuff happens, and there's, just a slew of spreadsheets and all these systems because the process mapping hasn't been done. What the process mapping allows people to do is to really focus on, the data that matters, and then create systems that tie, those data points together. So going back to your question, what's data that shouldn't be tracked or doesn't need to be? Here's a really good example. They're probably the most critical thing. One of the most critical things to track in cultivation is, of course, just what your environmental conditions are, your temperature, your relative humidity, dew point, however you want to look at it. Looking at that and making sure that the equipment's working appropriately, super important. But it has to be a continuous monitoring that makes it super important. So looking on a Ritter, or Argus, or Priva or something, having even like a Govee sensor in the room, if you don't have sophisticated controls, is fine. But looking, kind of this sine wave between your day and night, and it's really important to do that. What's not really important to do is, and I've heard, clients going out and basically, using a hand meter at not consistent times of the day, maybe a couple times a day, and taking an arbitrary reading in their room with a hand meter, marking the temp and RH, going to the next room, and then tracking and logging that data. That doesn't make sense to do at all for many reasons, but it's a massive waste of time. Validating sensors on some frequency is good, but that's not what I'm talking about. Another one is I don't think it makes sense to digitally track like daily equipment and maintenance checks. I think that there are some data points that fall into like day-to-day, like literally day, I guess it's called day over day, like, one day to the next, like how things change, but doesn't really need to be tracked historically. And that would be like, like pressure readings coming into RO, or, off of your pumps or things like that. That does not need to be tracked digitally. Keep that like, in the field, handwritten paper. But like tank water temperature, we could track that because that's going to change seasonally. And there's probably a pretty long list, but yeah, it's stuff like that we really just need to identify what the ownership and the C-suite needs to identify what the high level KPIs are, and then that needs to trickle down so that all of the independent, like the directors or managers, can gather the data to hit those KPIs.
Yeah, I'm sensing a theme of what you've said. Anything that doesn't really show trends, like if it's something that could just happen once and it's just something you need to like spot check, like that's one thing, but like you don't need to worry about making that historical. If it's something that actually shows a change over time, like you said, like if it's seasonally or day over day or something like that, that could affect like a specific growth cycle, like a 90-day growth cycle, like that's what we should be more focused on in cultivation.
Yeah. And I think, one of the biggest things with data and data collection specifically is, the most important thing in data collection isn't, collecting every single data point. It's collecting the most important ones consistently and repeatably. And the most surefire way to like make something more consistent and repeatable, it sounds so dumb, but it's, just make it as easy as possible. Because the easier something is to do and the more integrated it is in your day-to-day, the more likely people are to do it. And the less kind of freedom that they have to like, put their own spin on it, the more consistent and clean the data will be. So like anything that, if there's any tracking that needs to be historically analyzed, any of the post-harvest metrics, wet weights, different dry weights coming out of there, testing results, irrigation logs, whatever, having that handwritten, and then the handwritten needs to be put into digital, that is an absolute non-starter. So data that we need to historically track, it should be a hard line that we do not handwrite that, because just the mistakes that can happen and just the annoyance and how cumbersome it is, like handwritten data, it should not happen. that being said, not every cultivator and not every post-harvest person or packaging or processing person has a strong background with Excel or other kind of tools, and that's understandable. But that's what I help people with. It's developing systems to do it as easy as possible and tying it all together and making everybody's lives a little bit easier in the process.
Yeah, I've learned in operations something even just as simple as a checklist is like the best thing that you could do in any industry. I mean, like doctors use them, pilots use them, cultivators should be using them too, like a checklist just to regularly go through all these things that they need to be doing on a monthly or quarterly or yearly basis to collect, and just making it repeatable and documented so that they're not missing something really important.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny that you bring up the checklist with pilots. I was literally just talking to a data company the other day, and he used that same analogy, and I think it's perfect. It's like, very rarely do planes crash, and they 100% of takeoffs, they go through a thorough checklist so that they ensure they don't miss anything. And we were talking about how useful that is for like daily room walkthroughs and daily cleaning and things like that. So couldn't agree more.
No one's above a checklist, if that's a good takeaway from this talk. Well, that's great. And I think that's really helpful for people to understand, because I think people can just get like overwhelmed by just how much there is that you could be analyzing. And I think that can probably just like alleviate some people's concerns about like, okay, like I need to call Jeremy and figure out what I need to focus on. So I'd love to kind of hear from your experience. You've been in so many facilities. You've done, millions of square feet of build outs and expansions and just ongoing operational work. So I'd love to know, like, what's some of the most common mistakes that you see in these facilities? Like, I don't know, what's like your biggest example of like the biggest thing that people could do better or are failing at right now in cultivation?
That is such a big question that could be taken so many so many different ways.
Choose your own adventure.
I mean, on the design. So if we're talking like facility design and build out, one of the biggest mistakes I see is that, well, one, even people who are willing to, they have the desire to spend the money and put in the resources to making it, a state-of-the-art facility. A lot of times they spend money on the wrong things. I've got there's certainly I'm not going to mention any of the facility information by name, but there was a facility that I went to, and they had the most unbelievably nice doors on their grow rooms. Like these were like solid hardwood, but like also waterproof, heavy, and just like unbelievably nice doors. They had power generation, backup power, enough backup power generators that they could, 1.5 times over power their whole facility, in the event of a power outage. That's great. And hats off, a lot of other cool luxury things, but they didn't have any automated irrigation. This is like a 150,000 square foot. It was all hand watering, all manual tank filling. There was no environmental controls in the rooms. Like they had a very antiquated, disconnected system. So they weren't able to remotely access any of their equipment. They weren't even able to remotely get alarms, about their environmentals. So it's just interesting, it doesn't matter if you spent $40 million on what you thought was an awesome facility. If that $40 million was spent on really nice doors instead of automated irrigation, you might not do as well if you were to, set different priorities. So prioritizing importance of things, also, and This is kind of a really big, important hill that I've been dying on lately, but is the importance of having department managers' offices and like locations in the area that the work's being done. And the biggest example of that is, I don't even know if this is 50%, but a large number of facilities I go to, they do not have like a manager office or something back in cultivation, and their managers actually have desks up front with the sales team and HR and whatever. And that kind of level of disconnect reduces the accessibility so much, and it makes it way harder for the team to ask questions appropriately. And as such, people make assumptions, or if they do need to ask questions, and a lot of times they're saying scrubbed in, in their clean room clothes, then going to what's not a clean room, the front offices in there. So there's biosecurity concerns. And so I always recommend to have, dedicated workspace back in cultivation, cultivation managers, technical staff, director of cultivation. You do not need to be with the C-suite and the sales team up front. You need to be back with your people. And I think that's unbelievably critical.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Because I worked in a facility that had one of those, and I couldn't imagine like if that individual had to go back and forth and like unscrub and rescrub several times a day for whatever reason. That is just that in and of itself. But yeah, and then just having close proximity to your team to hear problems and issues. Because I think a lot of times, yeah, you do get that disconnect between managers and like your cultivation techs. So like you've got to have that, like you said earlier, that frequent communication. That's so important. Anything else you see as like a big mistake? That's kind of like facility design. Anything on like operations or anything like, because you work on a lot of expansions too. Anything from like the expansion side?
Cassie, don't even get me started about expansions. Those are, I do a lot of that work, in my day to day of helping people with facility expansions, or, even upgrading equipment, and implementing new controls, in existing facilities. And you and I have talked about it a whole lot, but there is so much that goes into the planning and scheduling of upgrades, expansions, retrofits. And it's so critical just because of how expensive it costs to keep a flower room empty for a day, for a week, mm-hmm. for a month. So if you miss a timeline when you're building, I don't know, like a convenience store or something, and you miss a timeline for a day, maybe that's not going to have like enormous revenue, maybe a couple thousand or $10,000 or something like that. But you miss a couple days for a cultivation room and getting it online, you're talking, tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. It's really massive, and delays on production and construction can be enough to just sink a whole company. It could be there's a word for that, but like an Achilles heel. That's not the word, but so between the intensive planning that goes into, minimizing downtime and working with the installers to make sure that everything's cohesive and there aren't going to be any delays, and you have to really have a lot of foresight on equipment lead times to make sure that nothing is going to get in that way. There's also biosecurity concerns with having contractors in kind of clean areas, or even going back and forth. But not to totally dissuade from that. I know you asked about the facility stuff, but the biggest thing, I don't want to frame it as the biggest mistake that people make, because it's not like that. But the biggest room for improvement that I see most facilities have, and this is pretty darn industry wide, and it's really easy, is goal setting. I don't think that people are doing enough work developing, communicating, and celebrating goals for their teams. So we've talked a lot about trimming. So let's just talk about, let's just keep the continuity and talk about trimming. So, imagine you are a trimmer. You are at a table listening to some cool music in the background, and you're just trimming buds all day. Well, you're gonna have a totally different psychological response if you're just trimming and the attitude is, well, we'll see how much we can trim today, and that's how much we'll trim, versus, okay, everybody's goal today is to hit, everybody needs to trim 3 pounds, or the aggregate team needs to trim 30 pounds today, because we need to get through this batch, and we need to get through this batch so we can start the next batch tomorrow. It's just a totally different psychological switch. I do a lot of running, and if somebody told me to go outside and just, well, why don't you just run as far as you can, or run until you get tired, I'd be like, but if I'm like, okay, well, I'm training for this thing and I have a goal to do whatever, a race at some point, and then I set a plan, to make that goal, then it creates kind of a psychological response and a very real progression of continuous improvement and incremental change. And I think that is so unbelievably understated. I would say that production quotas and stuff and tasks tend to be more goal oriented for some departments, but packaging, I very rarely see quotas and plans and projections established. Today we are going to fill 10,000 vape carts and package 900 units of gummies or something. It's just and so having the organization to say we are going to get X done today, and then tomorrow we're going to get X done, and then Friday we're going to get X done, and that's the goal. I think people respond really well to that, and it also creates an ability for, and I'm not talking big equity incentives or big bonus things, but ways to celebrate small wins, on the packaging line, oh, we've got a big batch to get done today. This might take a little longer, or it's going to require a little bit more grit to knuckle down and get it in, but we're going to do it. And if we can get this batch done today, maybe whatever's appropriate at that facility. So it works. I don't know how else to say it, but it works. It works for fun things like video games. It works for not fun things like running. It works for facility management. And so people really homing in on kind of the simple yet really critical ways to use our human psychology and hardwiring to make people happier and be more productive. I think it's real win-win-win for everybody.
I think everybody can take that lesson, whether you're in cultivation or any other area. I'm even thinking for myself, how nice would it be if I set myself a goal at the beginning of the day and been okay, if I got this done, and this done, I'm good. It also relieves you at the end of the day to be able to let go of your work day and and feel good about it, and then go into the next day as a better self. And you're right, it doesn't matter what the goal is. It's just the idea that you achieved what you set out to do in that period of time. So that way you can rest properly and come back the next day and reach another goal. I think we all can learn from that lesson. I think it's a great one.
Yeah. I mean, our bodies are programmed to release dopamine, and like basically everything that we do revolves around dopamine, and it crossing something off of a checklist, or achieving a goal, completing a task and like seeing it physically being crossed off. That all releases dopamine, so like it feels good and it makes everybody happy. So yeah, just incorporating simple stuff like that makes such a big difference. So we're not just treading water, we're heading towards a goal, and we can, as we do hit these goals, going back to the running thing, I know I'm going on forever about this, but now I'm getting excited just talking about it. But nobody was able to run a 4-minute mile, and people thought that it was impossible, that a human cannot do that. Then I don't remember what year, who did it. Somebody ran a 4-minute mile. Well, not long after that, I think it was like months or within a year, there's like a whole bunch of other people who immediately were able to, run a 4-minute mile. That exact same thing can be used in cultivation planning. So if you're setting goals, something that might look impossible, like maybe you've got a big cultivation room. It's always ideal to complete a harvest of a flower room in one day.
Right.
Like it creates all kinds of complexity and problems if you don't. But a lot of people, because of staffing or the size of the room or processes, they struggle with it, and that's okay. Yeah. But I guarantee it's possible. And so setting, maybe it takes you a total of 12 hours, split across 2 days to harvest a room. Okay, so the next harvest, why don't we try to hit 10 hours? Let's see what we can do to make things more efficient to hit 10 hours. So we're tracking that. Okay, then we hit 10 hours. You know what? If we could hit 10 hours, what if we just came in, an hour early the next time and see if we can get it done? Well, guess what? People want to leave on time. And so, they're probably going to get it done in whatever, 8, 9, 10 hours, but on that one day. And the next time it's like, can we get this done in an 8-hour shift? Let's try. And so you can see how kind of like the incremental improvement, and couple that with like, hey, if we can finish it in 10 hours, whatever, take the crew out to get a beer. Maybe everybody gets, $50 or, get stickers. I whatever people like, whatever works for individual teams, but
or just their time back. I mean, that in and of itself,
Yeah, and there's a lot of pride to that too. I mean, when you're with a team and you set a goal, maybe it's internally or you share it with the team to do something big like that. The team cares a lot and they're proud of it. So teams rally behind goals. Goals are the most critical part to this type of operation, especially since cannabis. Most of the processes, they're not independent. It's not somebody like an assembly line worker or something. It's people working in teams, working together, helping each other. And it creates a really interesting and unique opportunity to motivate people and to, I don't know, have fun doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's such a great point. I'm really glad that we talked about that. Because there's a human element to cultivation as well. It's not just about the plants, it's about the people that care for them. So I'm glad that we talked about that. There's another like employee, people-driven kind of idea that I want to talk about that we mentioned briefly in previous conversations, and that's just kind of like standardization and autonomy in cultivation. We talked about, just this idea of following an SOP, and when is it okay to stray from the SOP? When can we use our human intuition? And when is it safe to express that maybe something could be done differently to make things better? Can you just kind of talk about that idea a little bit? And as a cultivation leader, like how you empower teams that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And this one can be a little tricky, and this is probably the one where, you mentioned this is about people. I think that cultivation is frankly more about the people than the plants. as weird as that might sound, but it is all about people. And in cultivation facilities generally, but mostly in cultivation, because we're working with a live organism. We're kind of torn apart by two things. One is the ability to be nimble and adaptive and flexible with the ever-changing realities of agriculture, horticulture. Sometimes unpredictable things happen. You need to be quick to make decisions. You have to be executive and decisive. On the other side, one way to define quality for a lot of people is consistency, and being able to create a consistent, repeatable product and having a consistent, repeatable process. So we've got these two very different things kind of waging war against each other. And quite frankly, the struggle is just balancing the two. It's, as a cultivation manager or, executive, you do have to set the standards, and, these are the SOPs, and this is how we run them. And we do not stray from that. Like this is, how you're going to prune plants. These are the goals to follow, when it comes to crop steering and irrigation strategy and environmental strategy and stuff like that. But then there's also the other side where there could be a better way to do it, or a more efficient way. And there could be, something that comes up that, was unexpected, and a quick decision has to be made. Maybe there was a pest or something, and so somebody has to make a call of what to do. Do you cut this branch off? Do you kill the plant? Do you kill several plants? Do you just spray it? Whatever it is, quick decisions have to be made, and sometimes they're outside of the SOPs. And I think it takes a good manager to be able to identify when that's appropriate. So it's just a little bit of a balancing act, and it's definitely one of the bigger struggles. I think it becomes a bigger struggle, especially with MSOs, when you have kind of a central figure creating standardized approach to different growers, different facilities, different markets. And if the grower at one of their sites, deviates from whatever the SOP is or whatever the directive is, they could get in trouble for that. They could lose their job over that, making the wrong decision if it's opposed to what they're told. But at the same time, so they're not going to, typically go rogue and, make decisions that don't match with what their boss is telling them. But sometimes they have to, because if they do what they were told, but it's not going to work, they could kill plants or have, reduced quality or yield or whatever. So I think that there's some level of like grace and understanding and flexibility that needs to come from the central leadership in, MSOs. I would say the challenges are different for everyone I've talked to, but that battle of the two opposites is usually omnipresent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like giving people ownership over their respective areas to a certain degree can be really helpful in that.
There definitely is. It's like ownership within guide rails.
Yeah, exactly.
Like there have to be guide rails that we don't want somebody to start running double the nutrient because they saw something on Instagram that they thought would be cool to try. It has to be done in like it can't be done in a vacuum. Like there should always be like free flowing communication between cultivation leaders to talk about different potential things, how to trial them in a meaningful way, following the scientific method and isolating other variables, and upper leadership needs to kind of be self-aware of their own egos and their own kind of deficiencies when it comes to that kind of thing, and be open to trialing different things or adjusting things. I think some of the most successful cultivators have been the ones that have the lowest ego, that have been open to trialing different things. You know, the big one in our recent lifetime was going from HPS to LED lights, and so many people were, you know, couldn't even imagine doing that. And but some people were first movers, and they learned how and got really good under the LEDs much quicker, and as a result, spending way less on energy and everything else. And
Great example. Yeah. This has been so fun, Jeremy. I've loved having this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm sure we could talk. I feel like we could talk for another hour about this kind of stuff. And maybe we'll just have to have you back on. But I'd love, if people want to learn more about your work and how to reach you, how can they do that?
so I've got a really great website. It's under construction right now, as we're redeveloping it, but it's opensourcehorticulture.com. My email is jeremy@opensourcehorticulture.com. Follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn. It's just Open Source Horticulture. And yeah, Cassie, thanks so much for having me on. I always love talking to you.
Awesome. So that wraps episode 11 of Big Ideas in Cannabis. If you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you get future notifications of episodes coming in the months to come. And hope everybody has a great November, and we'll see you in December.